The Ocarina of Time is, of course, absolutely legendary, but there is a particular kind of frustration that only Nintendo can produce, and it is the frustration that comes not from something they did badly, but from something they did brilliantly and then seemingly decided the world did not need to see again. The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time is, by almost any measure you care to apply, one of the greatest video games ever made. It is the kind of game that gets discussed not just in terms of whether it's good, but in terms of what it meant, what it changed, and how profoundly it reshaped the landscape of an entire medium. When it launched on the Nintendo 64 in 1998, it did not simply raise the bar for 3D adventure games, it invented the bar. It established conventions for camera systems, for lock-on combat, for environmental storytelling and dungeon design that are still present in games being made today, nearly 30 years later. It is a game that people return to across decades to find, to their continued amazement, that it still holds up. And yet, for all of that, the most refined and complete version of that experience, the version that takes everything that was already extraordinary and makes it sharper and cleaner and more comfortable to play, exists exclusively on a handheld console with a screen roughly the size of a playing card. The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time 3D, released for the Nintendo 3DS in 2011, is, by almost every objective measure, the definitive version of the game. It is more beautiful, more intuitive, and more content-rich, and more playable than the Nintendo 64 original. And yet, despite Nintendo now having access to hardware that could showcase this remake in a way that the 3DS simply cannot, despite the existence of the Nintendo Switch and its sequel, the Switch 2, modern players who want to experience Ocarina of Time through official channels are consistently handed the 1998 original rather than its 2011 refinement. That is the central strangeness I want to explore today, because I think it deserves to be talked about properly. How did Nintendo create what is arguably the definitive version of the greatest game ever made, and then leave it stranded on hardware that the world has largely moved on from? I am Lady Arcade. If you love nostalgia, hit that subscribe button, because it's time to talk about the Ocarina of Time 3D, the best version stuck on the wrong console. Before we talk about the remake and what makes it so special, I think it's worth spending a moment with the original, because to understand why the 3DS version is such an achievement, you need to understand just how much pressure it was under going in. Ocarina of Time in 1998 was not simply a new Zelda game, it was the moment the series leaped 2 dimensions to 3, and it carried it with the weight of enormous expectation. The Super Nintendo's A Link to the Past had been one of the most defining games of its generation, beloved by millions of players and considered by many to be among the finest games ever created. The idea of taking that world and those mechanics and that sense of scale and wonder and translating it all into a fully 3-dimensional space was genuinely daunting, and the fact that Nintendo not only succeeded but produced something that many people consider even greater than its predecessor is one of the most remarkable achievements in gaming history. The game introduced Z-targeting, a lock-on system for combat and interaction that solved one of the most significant design problems facing 3D action games at the time, and became so influential that variations of it appear in virtually every third-person action game made since. It built a world that felt genuinely alive for its era, with a day and night cycle, characters who moved and changed and reacted to your actions, and a structure that expanded and transformed as the story progressed. The dungeons were architectural puzzles of extraordinary craft, each one built around a central mechanic that you learned, applied, and then subverted in ways that felt consistently satisfying. But here is the thing, the Nintendo 64 version, for all of its genius, also shows its age in ways that are impossible to ignore once you have experienced the remake. The textures are blurry and flat in the way that Nintendo 64 textures always were, a product of the hardware limitations of the time rather than any artistic intent. The character models are simple, with faces that communicate emotion only in the broadest possible terms. The menus are clunky and slow in a way that was unremarkable in 1998, but feels genuinely friction-producing today. And the Water Temple, one of gaming's most notorious experiences, contains a particular kind of frustration that I suspect anyone who played the original will feel somewhere in their bones the moment I mention it. None of this diminishes the original, it remains a masterpiece, but it does mean that when a team sat down in 2011 to build the 3DS remake, they had meaningful problems to solve alongside the visual overhaul, and the way they solved those problems is a large part of what makes Ocarina of Time 3D so impressive. The most immediately obvious thing about Ocarina of Time 3D, the thing that hits you the moment you begin playing, is how beautiful it is. Because the way the visual upgrade was handled is more thoughtful than a simple description like better graphics would suggest. Grezzo did not simply upscale the original textures or apply a filter to make them look sharper. They rebuilt the game's visuals from the ground up, creating entirely new three-dimensional assets that honour the original's artistic direction, while taking full advantage of what the 3DS hardware could do. Every texture has been redesigned, every environment has been given a level of detail that the Nintendo 64 version simply could not render, and the character models have been rebuilt with expressive, articulate faces that can actually convey the emotions the story requires, which turns out to be more important than you might expect when you're playing through a narrative that asks you to feel genuine connections to the people that you encounter. Hyrule Field, which in the original was a vast and somewhat sparse expanse of flat green, becomes something genuinely atmospheric in the remake, with rolling terrain, richer vegetation, and a sense of scale and openness that feels properly epic rather than simply large. Kokiri Forest is warmer and more densely realised. The temples, which in the original were occasionally difficult to read spatially because of how the limited geometry was rendered, became cleaner and more legible while simultaneously feeling grander and more imposing. The Fire Temple, the Forest Temple and the Shadow Temple, all of them benefit enormously from the visual rebuild, and the increased clarity makes navigation and puzzle solving feel more satisfying rather than less challenging. To add to the improvements, the stereoscopic 3D effect, which was the defining feature of the 3DS hardware, was also used thoughtfully in this game. Depth in dungeons feels more tangible, distances in outdoor environments are easy to judge, and certain movements, particularly the sequences involving the Sacred Realm and the final confrontation with Ganon, carry a visual weight in 3 dimensions that the flat original simply couldn't match. This was not a lazy port dressed up in a new coat of paint. It was a genuine and careful act of restoration, the kind of work you do when you respect the source material deeply and want to honour it rather than simply monetize it. Beyond the visual transformation, what makes Ocarina of Time 3D feel like a genuinely modern experience rather than simply a prettier one is the range of usability improvements that were built into the remake, many of which are small in isolation but collectively transform the experience of playing through the game. The inventory management system is one of the most significant areas of improvement. In the Nintendo 64 original port in the game, to access your equipment and assign items to buttons was a process that constantly interrupted the flow of play, particularly in sections that required you to switch between items frequently. The 3DS version moves the equipment management to the touchscreen, allowing you to assign and swap items without leaving the action, without pausing, without breaking your immersion in the world. It sounds like a minor convenience until you are in the middle of a dungeon that requires constant equipment changes, at which point it feels like an extraordinary quality of life improvement that should have been there from the very beginning. The menus are cleaner and more intuitive throughout. Information that was buried in submenus or presented in ways that required familiarization is now more clearly laid out and easier to navigate. The map system is more readable, the pause menu is more logically organized, None of these changes alters what the game is or how it plays, but they consistently reduce the small moments of friction that accumulate over the course of a long playthrough, and that older players in particular will remember as minor irritants that were simply part of the original experience. Further to this, the gyroscopic aiming system, which allows players to fine-tune their aim with the bow, the slingshot and other ranged equipment by physically tilting the console, is one of the remake's most genuinely clever additions. It works beautifully. The combination of traditional stick aiming for large movements and gyroscopic correction for precision feels natural very quickly and makes the game's range sections significantly more satisfying. It is also, rather pointedly, exactly the kind of feature that the Nintendo Switch's motion controls would handle perfectly, which makes its absence on that platform feel all the more inexplicable every time you think about it. I cannot talk about the improvements in Ocarina of Time without dedicating proper time to the Water Temple, because the Water Temple is one of gaming's most famous pain points, and the way the remake addresses it is a genuinely good example of thoughtful game design, working to preserve the integrity of a challenging dungeon while removing the specific and arbitrary frustrations that surrounded it. For those of you who may not have experienced the original Water Temple in all of its difficult glory, here is the situation. The dungeon requires you to repeatedly raise and lower the water level throughout the temple, which in turn requires you to wear and remove the iron boots constantly in order to sink to lower levels or swim to higher ones. In the Nintendo 64 version, the iron boots were not assigned to a quick access button. They were a menu item, which meant that every single time you needed to put them on or take them off, you had to pause the game, navigate through the inventory, equip the boots, unpause, take a step, and often immediately pause again to remove them. In a dungeon built almost entirely around the mechanic of wearing and removing those boots, this created a rhythm of constant interruption that made the Water Temple feel far more frustrating than its actual puzzle design had warranted. The 3DS version assigns the iron boots to the touchscreen, like other key items, which means that you can equip and unequip them with a single tap without ever pausing the game. The dungeon is otherwise unchanged. The puzzles are the same, and the structure is the same. The Water Temple is still challenging and complex, as it should be, but the specific arbitrary frustration of the boot swapping, the thing that became a meme and a complaint and a piece of gaming cultural shorthand for a certain kind of design irritant, is simply gone. What remains is a genuinely well-designed dungeon that you can now appreciate as its creators intended, and that is exactly what a good remake should do. One of the things that makes Ocarina of Time feel like a genuinely substantial package rather than a simple visual refresh is the inclusion of Master Quest, and I think this is an aspect of the remake that does not get discussed as much as it deserves. Master Quest was created for a planned Nintendo 64 disc drive release in Japan, a piece of hardware that never made it to other territories before eventually being included as a bonus on a GameCube compilation disc. For many players outside Japan, the 3DS version was their first real opportunity to experience it in a convenient and comfortable format, and it represents a meaningfully different way to play through the game. Master Quest remixes the layouts of all of the game's dungeons, rearranging puzzles, repositioning enemies, and altering the solutions to challenges in ways that will genuinely surprise players who thought they knew the game inside out. The difficulty is also increased, with enemies dealing double damage throughout, which gives the experience a more demanding edge that feels appropriate for players returning to a game they had already mastered. It is not a small addition. It is essentially a second alternate version of the entire game built into the same same package, which means Ocarina of Time 3D offers experienced players a genuine reason to return beyond nostalgia. In the 3DS version, Master Quest also presents the entire game completely mirrored, with Hyrule laid out as a mirror image of what players know. It is a disorienting and clever touch that adds another layer of unfamiliarity to dungeons you may have explored dozens of times, making even the earliest areas feel subtly strange and new. The combination of remixed dungeons, increased difficulty, and the mirrored world makes Master Quest in the 3DS version the most complete and accessible form the mode has ever been presented in, and it is one of several reasons why the remake feels like the definitive edition rather than simply a prettier one. In the interest of being thorough and fair, I do want to address the criticisms that have been directed at the 3DS remake, particularly around certain changes that were made to the content of the game compared to the original 1998 release. The most frequently discussed changes involve a small number of visual and cultural elements that were altered between the Nintendo 64 version and the 3DS remake. Certain symbols, most notably a design on the Fire Temple's walls, and a texture on the mirror shield, were changed from what appeared in the original Japanese release, a process that had actually begun with regional versions of the Nintendo 64 game but was carried through consistently in the 3DS version. There were also some minor alterations to character designs in specific contexts, such as blood and gore removal throughout the Spirit Temple. These are real changes, and players who prefer to experience the game in its original form have a legitimate point when they note that the remake is not a pixel-perfect reproduction of the 1998 version. However, I think it is important to keep these criticisms in proper proportion. The changes that were made are genuinely minor in the context of the overall experience. They don't affect the story, the gameplay, the dungeon design, the music, or any of the elements that make Ocarina of Time the game it is. They are the kind of alterations that the vast majority of players would not notice without being told about them, and they certainly do not diminish the remake status as the most polished and refined version of the experience available. Every remake and re-release involves decisions about what to preserve and what to update, and the 3DS version of Ocarina of Time made those decisions with considerably more care and respect for the source material than many comparable projects. The things it changed were minor. The things it improved were substantial, and on balance, the remake is undeniably a better version of the game than the original for the vast majority of players. Which brings me to the question that I keep returning to, the question that I think sits at the heart of everything that we have discussed today. Why is this remake still trapped on a handheld console that was discontinued in 2020? The Nintendo Switch is one of the most successful gaming platforms ever made. It has sold over 140 million units and sits in living rooms, backpacks, and bedrooms all over the world. It has a television output mode that would allow a remastered Ocarina of Time to be experienced on a large screen for the first time in a version that actually does the game visual justice. Its motion controls would accommodate the gyroscopic aiming that is one of the remake's best features without any modification whatsoever. Its larger screens in handheld mode would present the game's rebuilt visuals far more impressively than the 3DS's small display ever could. And the Nintendo Switch 2, with its improved hardware capabilities, would allow for further enhancements that could elevate the experience even further. Nintendo has re-released the original Nintendo 64 version of Ocarina of Time multiple times across multiple platforms. It was on the Wii Virtual Console. It was on the Wii U Virtual Console. It is available through Nintendo Switch Online with the Nintendo 64 app. Every time Nintendo looks at its back catalogue and decides what to offer modern players, it reaches for the 1998 original rather than the 2011 remake. Playing the old version today is still a meaningful and rewarding experience, and for certain players there is a purity to the original that the remake cannot replicate. But the idea that modern players, many of whom are discovering Ocarina of Time for the first time through Nintendo Switch Online, are experiencing the blurry textures and clunky menus, instead of the more refined, vastly more playable 3DS version, And that's genuinely baffling when you sit with it. This isn't a situation where the original is simply better. The remake is, in almost every measurable way, the superior version of the game. And yet it sits on a discontinued handheld, increasingly expensive to obtain as the 3DS collector market we discussed in my most recent video continues to heat up. Accessible only to those who already own the hardware or are willing to invest in acquiring it. Every year that passes without a Switch port is another year in which the definitive version of one of the most important games ever made becomes less accessible rather than more. Looking to the future on the Nintendo Switch 2 with its improved hardware, the rebuilt assets of the 3DS version could be enhanced further. The character models, which are already excellent on the 3DS, could be given additional detail. The environments, already dramatically improved over the Nintendo 64 original, could be given further texture resolution, richer lighting, and greater draw distances. The frame rates, which the 3DS had to manage carefully within its hardware limitations, could be unlocked entirely. All of this is achievable without fundamentally altering anything about the game itself, without changing the dungeons or the story or the music or any of the design decisions that make the game as it is. The gyroscopic gaming, which works beautifully on the 3DS but is constrained by the small screen and the awkwardness of physically tilting a clamshell handheld, would be genuinely excellent on a Switch or a Switch 2, where the motion controls are more precise. The screen is larger and the hardware is designed to be held comfortably in a variety of orientations. Master Quest mode, already a strong package on the 3DS, could be marketed as a distinct mode with a modern re-release, in a way that gives it more prominence and introduces it to a large number of players who have never experienced it. Nintendo could even include both the 3DS remake and the original N64 version in a single package, giving players the choice between the two and allowing the debate about which version they prefer to become a positive conversation rather than a frustrating one. This is the kind of thing Nintendo does well when it chooses to, when it decides that a piece of history deserves to be presented properly and given the audience it merits. The ingredients are all there, the work's already been done, the rebuilt assets exist, the improvements are made, the additional content is ready. All that is required for Nintendo to make the decision to bring it forward, and that decision has not come, and the longer it does not come, the more inexplicable it feels. I began this video by describing a particular kind of frustration that only Nintendo can produce, and I want to return to that idea now. The situation is not the frustration of something being bad, it's more the frustration of something being genuinely, almost secretly excellent and then being left in a place where fewer and fewer people will ever encounter it. Grezzo made something remarkable in 2011. They took a game that was already considered one of the greatest ever created, a game that's carried an almost impossible weight of expectation and reverence, and they improved it without diminishing it. They made it more beautiful, more intuitive, more accessible, more replayable, and more complete, all while preserving everything that made the original the masterpiece that it is. That is an extraordinarily difficult thing to do, and they did it beautifully. And that achievement deserves more recognition than a quiet release on a handheld that the world has since moved on from. One day, perhaps Nintendo will bring it forward. Perhaps the Switch 2 will be the moment. Perhaps the continued conversation about the 3DS library that the collector market is generating will remind enough people that this version exists and that it matters. So, well, I hope so. I genuinely hope so. The best version of the greatest game ever made deserves to be seen. It deserves a large screen and a modern audience, and the attention of the millions of Nintendo fans who have never had the chance to play it. It deserves better than being the best kept secret in Nintendo's back catalogue. If you enjoyed this upload, be sure to subscribe, and then you might want to watch my nostalgic video on the resurgence in popularity around the iconic Nintendo 3DS.